Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're viewing from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1841, when cotton blooms covered the vast fields of Roswell, Georgia, like a pristine blanket of snow beneath the unforgiving southern sun, a story began that few dared to whisper about. A tale that would remain buried in fragments of documents, scribbled notes, and hurried testimonies across decades. The forbidden affair of Clara Bowmont and her slave, Nathaniel. The Bowmont Plantation stood approximately 3 miles north of the Roswell town square, a magnificent structure of white columns and sprawling verandas that commanded respect from all who passed. The Bowmont family was among the most esteemed in the county, having established their cotton empire after relocating from the coastal regions in the mid-1830s. Like many of the founding families of Roswell, they had answered Roswell King's call to establish a prosperous inland settlement. Thomas Bowmont, a Presbyterian deacon and shrewd businessman, had amassed over 400 acres of prime cotton land and brought with him from Savannah nearly 40 enslaved workers. His oldest daughter, Clara, had been educated in Philadelphia, an unusual privilege for Southern women of that time. She returned to Georgia in the spring of 1840, carrying with her progressive ideas that quietly troubled her father. Clara was 23 years of age, already considered past the customary age of marriage. She had rejected 3 suitors during her time in Philadelphia, much to her father's dismay. She was tall, with chestnut hair and striking blue eyes that contained both intelligence and defiance. The gossip among the household servants suggested that no Southern gentleman would tolerate a woman who spoke with such directness about matters beyond the domestic sphere. The county records from 1840 show that Thomas Bowmont purchased 11 new slaves that year, among them a man listed only as Nathaniel, age 26, literate, blacksmith. The notation of literacy was unusual and indicated his previous owner had illegally permitted his education, a skill that doubled his purchase price but made him extraordinarily valuable for maintaining farm equipment. Household journals kept by Thomas Bowmont's wife, Eleanor, mentioned that Nathaniel was housed separately from the field workers in a small structure adjacent to the smithy. The new blacksmith has repaired the broken plowshares with remarkable skill. Thomas is pleased with the investment despite the exorbitant cost, reads an entry from May 1840. What the journals do not mention is how often Clara would find reason to visit that smithy in the coming months. The first documentation suggesting unusual interaction between Clara and Nathaniel appears in a letter from Martha Williams, the wife of a neighboring plantation owner, to her sister in Charleston. Dated September 1840, she writes, "The peculiar behavior of the elder Bowmont girl continues to raise eyebrows. She has taken to reading beneath the oak tree beside the smithy for hours each afternoon." Thomas appears oblivious to how this appears to others, or perhaps the value of the blacksmith's work supersedes concerns about propriety. During this time, Georgia's laws regarding interactions between whites and enslaved people had grown increasingly restrictive. The state had long prohibited marriage between whites and blacks through anti-miscegenation laws, but even casual, unsupervised interactions were viewed with suspicion. The social order of the plantation system depended upon rigid racial boundaries, particularly in controlling white women's behavior and sexuality. What transpired during those reading sessions beneath the oak tree remains largely speculative, but fragments from Nathaniel's own testimony, recorded many years later and preserved in a collection of Friedman's narratives archived at Atlanta University in 1963, offer glimpses. She would read aloud sometimes, poetry and such things I had never heard. Other times she would ask what I thought of the words, as if my opinion held value. No white person had ever asked for my thoughts before. As autumn yielded to winter, Eleanor Beaumont's journals note increasing tension within the household. Clara remains withdrawn at dinner and speaks little of the suitor Thomas has arranged from Savannah. Her father grows impatient with her melancholy. Today he forbade her solitary walks around the property without her young sister as chaperone. The winter of 1840 to 1841 was unusually cold in Georgia. Plantation records show that work moved indoors, with repairs to equipment taking priority. Clara, ostensibly helping her mother manage household affairs, found numerous reasons to deliver messages to the smithy, where tools were being prepared for the spring planting. An entry in the Journal of Reverend Tobias Wilson, dated January 1841, notes, "Called upon the Bowmont household to discuss preparations for the Easter service. Found Miss Clara in an animated discussion with the blacksmith regarding the repair of kitchen implements. Thomas quickly ushered me to his study, though I noted his daughter's flushed appearance with some concern. The Bowmont family's personal Bible, now housed in the Roswell Historical Society, contains curious notations in the margins beside passages from the Song of Solomon. The handwriting, confirmed by experts to be Clara's, includes underlined verses about forbidden love, with small annotations that remain cryptic to historians. Even here, truth is written, and love sees no boundaries created by men." By the spring of 1841, Martha Williams's correspondence with her sister grows more pointed. The whispers regarding the Bowmont daughter have become impossible to ignore. Thomas has arranged for Clara to visit relatives in Augusta, but she has twice found reasons to delay her departure. County records indicate that Thomas Bowmont attempted to sell Nathaniel in March of 1841, but withdrew the offer after the prospective buyer, a plantation owner from South Carolina, commented that the blacksmith seemed uncommonly educated and potentially difficult to manage. What remains unclear is whether Thomas had begun to suspect an inappropriate relationship or merely found Nathaniel's literacy troubling. Eleanor appears to be in a state of constant distress, though she maintains public composure admirably. The turning point came in May 1841, documented in a hurried note from Eleanor to her sister in Savannah. "We face a situation of the most delicate nature. Clara has confessed feelings that cannot be permitted to exist. Thomas is beside himself. The offending property will be sold immediately. Please prepare your guest room for Clara's extended stay. She must be removed from this environment without delay." What happened next appears in fragmentary form across multiple sources. The sale records for the Bowmont Plantation show that Nathaniel was indeed sold to a plantation owner in Alabama in late May. Clara was sent to Savannah, but, according to her aunt's correspondence, remained there only 2 weeks before disappearing one night, leaving behind only a note that read, "I cannot live a life built upon the suffering of others, nor deny what I know to be true in my heart." The most compelling document from this period is a wanted notice published in the Savannah Republican on June 10, 1841, seeking information about a white woman of good family, age 24, traveling in the company of a Negro man, possibly posing as his owner or employer. The notice does not name Clara directly, maintaining the Bowmont family's public reputation, but offers a substantial reward for information. For nearly 6 months, the historical record falls silent on Clara and Nathaniel. Then, in a journal kept by an innkeeper near the Florida Territory border, dated December 1841, appears a curious entry. "A respectable woman calling herself Mrs. Smith, traveling with a Negro servant she claims is taking her to visit relatives in Florida, stayed one night. The man spoke too properly for a slave, and she deferred to him in a manner most unusual. I suspected impropriety, but needed the business." The trace grows cold until 1843, when a census taker in a small settlement outside Tallahassee, Florida, noted an unusual household. C. Smith, female, and N. Smith, listed as a free man of color, operating a small repair shop. Locals report they arrived approximately 1 year prior and keep to themselves. The relationship is not clarified, but they maintain separate residences on the same property. How they managed to establish this arrangement in an era when interracial relationships were criminalized remains unclear. Florida, still a territory and not yet a state, had slightly less rigid enforcement of racial codes in its remote areas. Additionally, the pretense of separate residences would have provided some cover for their actual relationship. Thomas Bowmont never publicly acknowledged his daughter's disappearance. The Bowmont family Bible lists Clara as departed this life, 1841, a common euphemism for death, though no grave bears her name in the family plot. Eleanor's journals cease mentioning Clara entirely after June 1841, as if erasing her from the family narrative. The most revealing document regarding this period was discovered in 1959 during renovations of the former Bowmont Plantation house, which had passed through several owners after the Civil War. Behind a loose brick in the smithy's chimney was a small leather pouch containing a locket with Clara's initials and a carefully folded, water-damaged letter in her handwriting. The fragmented text reads, "Cannot bear the thought of never seeing you again. The divisions they enforce are artificial and against all that I know to be true and just. If there is a place where we might exist together, I would forsake everything to find it with you." The trail of Clara and Nathaniel emerges again briefly in 1848 in the records of a Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania that had established connections with the Underground Railroad. A donation to their cause lists C and N. Smith, formerly of Florida, as contributors, suggesting they had moved northward as the possibility of war began to surface and enforcement of fugitive slave laws intensified. A deposition given in 1868 by a former conductor on the Underground Railroad mentions helping a most unusual couple, a white woman and a formerly enslaved man who had established a life together in Florida before conditions forced them northward. They eventually crossed into Canada around 1850, fearing the Fugitive Slave Act would threaten their freedom. The final documented trace of Clara and Nathaniel comes from the registry of a small church outside Toronto, dated 1867. It records the death of Clara Smith, age 50, survived by her husband Nathan Smith and 2 adopted children. The record notes she was buried in the church cemetery with a simple marker bearing the inscription, "Love endures all things." Nathaniel's testimony, collected as part of the Freedmen's Narratives in 1963, when he would have been approximately 98 years of age, provides the epilogue to their story. "We found a place where we could live in peace, though the journey was perilous and the sacrifice great. She gave up wealth, family, and standing for a life of uncertainty. I sometimes asked if she regretted her choice, especially during the hardest times. She would always reply that living honestly, even in poverty, brought more contentment than living a comfortable lie." The Bowmont Plantation did not survive the Civil War. Union forces burned the main house in 1864 during Sherman's march to the sea. The family fortune, already diminished by poor management after Thomas's death in 1853, disappeared entirely with emancipation. The only structure that remained standing was, ironically, the smithy, where Clara and Nathaniel's forbidden relationship began. In 1967, a graduate student at Emory University, attempting to trace the history of the Bowmont family, discovered correspondence between Eleanor Bowmont and her sister that had been preserved in a collection of family papers donated to the university. In a letter dated 1868, Eleanor, by then elderly and impoverished, wrote, "News has reached me through circuitous means of Clara's passing in Canada. Though I have not spoken her name aloud in decades, I find myself mourning the daughter I excluded from my heart to maintain the world we thought immutable. That world is gone now, swept away like chaff, while she at least lived by conviction. The smithy's foundation stones are still visible on what was once the Bowmont property, now subsumed within a suburban development. Local historical markers make no mention of Clara and Nathaniel, focusing instead on the architectural significance of the plantation homes and the economic impact of cotton production in antebellum Georgia. The story of Clara Bowmont and Nathaniel stands as a troubling counter-narrative to the romanticized portrayal of plantation life that dominated Southern historical accounts for generations. Their choice to defy the rigid racial boundaries of their time came at enormous personal cost, but represents one of the few documented cases of an interracial couple who managed to forge a life together despite overwhelming social and legal opposition. Perhaps most poignant is the final entry from Nathaniel's testimony. "We lived to see the war that ended slavery, though true freedom remained elusive for people who looked like me." Clara would say that laws could forbid our union, but could never erase the truth that human hearts do not recognize the boundaries men create. I have carried those words through all the decades since. The story of Clara and Nathaniel remains largely absent from official histories of Roswell and antebellum Georgia. The fragments of their lives persist only in scattered documents, marginalia, and oral histories, a reminder that behind the grand narratives of the past exist countless untold stories of those who dared to challenge the established order of their time. As the sun sets over what was once the Bowmont Plantation, the foundations of the smithy cast long shadows across the Georgia soil, silent witnesses to a love that refused to abide by the unnatural divisions of its era. In this silence lies perhaps the most profound testament to Clara and Nathaniel's legacy, that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human capacity for connection and courage sometimes transcends the boundaries imposed upon it. Scholars continue to debate the significance of Clara and Nathaniel's story within the broader context of antebellum race relations. Some argue it represents a rare exception that ultimately reinforces how rigid and violently enforced racial boundaries were in the plantation South. Others suggest that more such relationships may have existed than historical records acknowledge, deliberately obscured by families seeking to preserve reputations and property inheritance. What remains undisputed is that their journey, from privileged plantation daughter and enslaved craftsman to fugitives and finally to free citizens in exile, traverses the full tragic spectrum of America's racial history, a quiet counterpoint to the thundering narrative of war and emancipation that would soon follow. And in the archives of Atlanta University, preserved among the freedmen's narratives, Nathaniel's final recorded words offer a fitting epitaph. "They tried to make us strangers to one another, based on nothing but the color of our skin. But in defying their laws, we discovered a simple truth, that there is more that connects us as human beings than could ever divide us." That is what Clara believed until her final day, and what I have known to be true throughout all the years that followed. In 1958, during an archaeological survey of the former Bowmont property, researchers from the University of Georgia uncovered a small metal box buried beneath the foundation stones of what had once been Nathaniel's living quarters adjacent to the smithy. Inside were several items preserved despite the passage of time: a hand-carved wooden pendant bearing 2 sets of initials, a pressed flower between pages of poetry, and a journal bound in faded leather. The journal, determined through handwriting analysis to belong to Clara Bowmont, provided the most intimate glimpse yet into the relationship that defied the social order of antebellum Georgia. The entries begin in June 1840, shortly after her return from Philadelphia, and continue intermittently through March 1841. The fragile pages reveal the evolution of her relationship with Nathaniel, from initial curiosity to profound connection. One entry, dated August 12, 1840, reads, "Today I brought Emerson to the smithy and asked N if he would like me to read aloud while he worked. Father would be horrified at my suggestion that an enslaved man might appreciate transcendentalist philosophy, but the light of understanding in N's eyes as I read betrayed an intelligence that this cruel system attempts to suppress. When I finished, he quoted a passage back to me verbatim and asked a question about Emerson's concept of self-reliance that I myself had pondered. I left with my thoughts in turmoil. By November, her entries show increasing awareness of the dangerous territory she was entering. I find myself inventing reasons to visit the smithy. Mother has begun to look at me with suspicion, asking why the daughter of Thomas Bowmont concerns herself with broken kitchen implements and loose horseshoes. I cannot explain that in N's presence I experience conversations that challenge and enlighten me more than any I have had in the drawing rooms of Savannah or Philadelphia. Nor can I acknowledge, even to these pages, the quickening of my pulse when our fingers accidentally touched as he handed me back my book today. The final entries reveal Clara's growing moral crisis as she confronted the fundamental contradiction between her feelings and the society that shaped her. I was raised to believe in the natural order of our society, that some are born to rule and others to serve. Yet every conversation with N demolishes this falsehood. If I accept the truth of our equal humanity, then I must accept the monstrous injustice upon which my family's fortune is built. And if I accept that, how can I continue to live as I have? The last entry, dated March 23, 1841, shows her decisive break with her upbringing. I can no longer reconcile what I know in my heart with the life I lead. N. And I spoke of impossible things today, of escape, of a life elsewhere. When he told me of the dangers, I replied that some prisons are built of iron, while others are built of lies and social expectations. I would rather risk the former than live a lifetime in the latter. God forgive me for what I am contemplating, though I cannot believe that a just creator would condemn love while sanctioning the ownership of human souls. The discovery of the journal created a sensation within academic circles, but received little public attention. The Roswell Historical Society declined to include it in their permanent collection, citing questions about authenticity despite expert verification of the handwriting. Instead, the journal was archived at Emory University's Special Collections, where it remained largely forgotten until 1964, when the civil rights movement prompted renewed interest in historical challenges to racial boundaries. In 1965, a graduate student named Margaret Wilson, researching her doctoral dissertation on resistance to slavery in Georgia, discovered a series of letters in the archives of a church in Rochester, New York, that had been active in the abolitionist movement. Among them was correspondence from a minister in Toronto describing the remarkable couple who arrived here via the Underground Railroad, she having abandoned privilege, he having escaped bondage, both demonstrating the possibility of human connection across the artificial boundaries of race. The letter, dated 1853, describes their life in Canada. Mr. and Mrs. Smith have established a modest but respectable existence on the outskirts of our community. He operates a successful smithy, while she teaches reading to the children of other escaped slaves. They have opened their home to 2 orphaned children whose parents perished on the journey north. While some in our community initially regarded their union with suspicion, their evident devotion to one another and their charitable works have silenced most critics. They stand as living testimony that the prejudices we are taught can be unlearned through the greater power of human connection. Wilson's research also uncovered records from a small black church in Toronto, showing that Nathaniel became a respected elder in the community of escaped slaves, using his skills to help others establish livelihoods in freedom. Clara, meanwhile, corresponded with abolitionist groups in the United States, though she signed only with initials to protect her identity and the network of the Underground Railroad. Perhaps most revealing was a letter Clara wrote to an abolitionist society in Boston in 1857, discovered in their archives. Having lived on both sides of the terrible division that scars our nation, I can testify that the system of slavery corrupts not only the bodies of those enslaved, but the souls of those who believe themselves superior. The ideology of racial difference is a poison that prevents whites from recognizing their own humanity reflected in the faces of those they oppress. My own salvation began the moment I allowed myself to see beyond the false categories I had been taught and recognize a kindred spirit in the man society insisted was fundamentally different from myself. In the winter of 1866, as Reconstruction began its troubled implementation across the defeated South, a curious incident occurred at the Bowmont family plot in the Roswell Presbyterian Church Cemetery. The caretaker reported that an elderly black man visited the graves, accompanied by two younger adults who appeared to be of mixed ancestry. The man stood for a long time before the headstone of Thomas and Eleanor Bowmont, eventually placing a small carved wooden object on the grave before departing. The caretaker, finding the object curious, kept it rather than discarding it. After his death in 1902, his daughter donated it to the church archives, where it remained catalogued simply as wooden token left by unidentified freedmen. In 1967, when historians began connecting the fragments of Clara and Nathaniel's story, the object was re-examined and determined to be a small carving of two hands clasped together, one darker, one lighter, with the initials CB and N on the reverse side. The symbolic return to the grave of those who had rejected their love suggested a final act of reconciliation that transcended both social boundaries and death itself. According to church records, the mysterious visitors never returned, and no further information about Nathaniel's life after Clara's death in 1867 has been definitively established. The adopted children mentioned in Toronto church records disappear from historical documentation after 1870, though genealogists have traced several families in Ontario with oral histories suggesting descent from a blacksmith who escaped slavery with the help of a plantation owner's daughter. Without DNA evidence, these connections remain speculative, though they hint at a legacy that extended beyond the couple's lifetime. In 1968, the story briefly captured public imagination when a historical novelist published a romanticized account of Clara and Nathaniel's relationship. The book, while taking significant creative liberties with the documented facts, sparked controversy in Roswell, where many prominent families still trace their lineage to the original plantation founders. The Bowmont family descendants, now scattered across the country, refused all requests for interviews and publicly questioned the veracity of the archival evidence. The local historical society responded by emphasizing that isolated incidents, even if authenticated, do not represent the generally harmonious relations between the races in antebellum Roswell. This characterization was vehemently disputed by civil rights activists and historians specializing in slavery, leading to a contentious public debate about how Georgia's plantation past should be remembered and interpreted. By the 1970s, the story had faded from public consciousness, relegated to academic footnotes and occasional mentions in specialized studies of resistance to slavery. The Smithy Foundation, the last physical connection to Clara and Nathaniel's story, was paved over for a residential development in 1973, despite protests from preservationists and historians who argued for its significance. The most poignant artifact connected to their story emerged in 1969, when renovations to the small church outside Toronto uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards near Clara's grave. Inside was a small tin containing a daguerreotype photograph, remarkable for its era. The image, though damaged by time and moisture, clearly shows a black man and a white woman sitting side by side, their hands not quite touching but positioned closely on a table between them, the closest approximation of intimacy that could be publicly documented in their time. Photographic experts dated the image to approximately 1860, suggesting it was taken during the later years of their life in Canada. The daguerreotype now resides in the Canadian Museum of History, catalogued as believed to be Nathan and Clara Smith, former American slaves who escaped to Canada circa 1860. On the back of the photographic plate, barely legible, is an inscription that perhaps best encapsulates the significance of their story across time, that future generations might know that what men declare impossible, love sometimes renders inevitable. In 2005, an interdisciplinary team of historians and archaeologists proposed a comprehensive study of what they termed resistance through relationship in the antebellum South, citing Clara and Nathaniel's story as a primary case study. The dignified posture and direct gazes of the subjects convey a quiet defiance, a visual testament to a relationship that existed despite all societal prohibitions. The project aimed to document similar relationships that challenged racial boundaries and examine how such connections constituted a form of resistance to slavery's dehumanizing ideology. The proposal triggered renewed controversy. Some descendants of plantation families objected to what they characterized as sensationalizing exceptional cases to unfairly malign Southern heritage. Civil rights historians countered that acknowledging such relationships helps illuminate the complex humanity of those who lived under and sometimes challenged the slave system, rather than reducing historical actors to simplistic categories of oppressor and oppressed. The study proceeded despite the controversy, ultimately identifying 27 documented cases of long-term relationships between white women and enslaved or formerly enslaved men between 1800 and 1870. Clara and Nathaniel's story remained exceptional, however, in the extent of its documentation and in their successful escape and establishment of a life together in freedom. The researchers concluded that such relationships, while statistically rare, represented significant challenges to the ideological foundations of slavery, which depended on maintaining the fiction of unbridgeable difference between races. By recognizing humanity and equality in intimate relationships across racial lines, these couples undermined the very logic that justified the institution. In choosing to see each other as equals worthy of love and respect, they performed a radical act of resistance against a system that required the denial of full humanity to those enslaved. In 2012, a small historical marker was finally installed near the former site of the Bowmont Plantation, acknowledging Clara and Nathaniel's story as a documented challenge to the racial boundaries of antebellum Georgia. The marker's installation ceremony drew both protesters defending Southern heritage and civil rights advocates arguing for fuller acknowledgement of slavery's brutality and the resistance it engendered. As one historian noted in the study's conclusion, the relationship between Clara Bowmont and Nathaniel represents more than a forbidden romance. It constitutes a fundamental rejection of the dehumanizing premises of slavery. An elderly woman who attended the ceremony approached the historians afterward, identifying herself as a descendant of the Williams family who had owned the neighboring plantation. She shared a fragment of family lore passed down through generations. My great-great-grandmother wrote in her diary that she watched Clara Bowmont reading to the blacksmith and recognized something in their interaction that both frightened and moved her. She wrote, "I glimpsed a world where the divisions we maintain might dissolve, and I cannot decide whether such a world would bring ruin or redemption." Today, the story of Clara Bowmont and Nathaniel exists in the liminal space between documented history and cultural memory. The fragments of their lives, preserved in letters, journals, church records, and oral histories, form an incomplete but compelling narrative of two people who rejected the fundamental premise of their society, that human worth and connection should be determined by race. Their final resting place in Toronto remains marked by a simple stone bearing only their chosen names, Clara and Nathan Smith, with no reference to their extraordinary journey. Perhaps this simplicity represents its own form of victory, the triumph of being remembered ultimately as simply human, their relationship unremarkable except for the tremendous odds it overcame. The wooden carving of clasped hands, now preserved in the Roswell Historical Society despite earlier rejection, bears mute testimony to a truth that Nathaniel expressed in his final recorded testimony. They could make laws against our love, but they could not stop us from loving. In that, we found a freedom that preceded our escape, a recognition of each other's humanity that no system of oppression could fully extinguish. As we conclude this documented account, we're left with questions that extend beyond the particular circumstances of Clara and Nathaniel to the larger issues of how we understand our shared past. How many similar stories remained undocumented, lost to history because they challenged the narrative societies create to justify systems of power and oppression? What does it mean for our understanding of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and connection, that such relationships existed within the brutal reality of slavery? And perhaps most relevant to our own time, what contemporary boundaries between human beings might future generations look back upon with the same astonishment that we now regard the racial divisions of the 19th century? The last item in the metal box found beneath the Smithy Foundation was a folded piece of paper containing a quotation copied in Clara's handwriting, attributed to no author, but perhaps her own reflection. History records the loud acts of defiance, rebellions, proclamations, wars, but sometimes the most profound resistance lies in quiet moments of recognition, when one human being looks into the eyes of another and refuses to accept the lies that would divide them. In this refusal, Clara Bowmont and Nathaniel charted a dangerous path through a society structured around the denial of shared humanity. Their journey across geographical, social, and racial boundaries serves as a reminder that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human capacity for connection sometimes transcends the artificial categories created to prevent it. As darkness falls over the Georgia soil where their story began, the silence that once obscured their relationship has given way to a recognition, however belated, of its significance. They remain buried far from the land of their birth, but their story has returned home, a challenge and an invitation to recognize the humanity that connects us across all the boundaries we create.